Hi, I want to talk to you today about John Calvin, and in particular about John Calvin as a philosopher. Calvin is best known not only as the founder of the Reformed Christian faith, but also for this book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's, as you can see, a massive volume. It's one that engages in a wide variety of theological speculations and theological arguments. It also contains a fair number of philosophical arguments. Now, Calvin is not usually viewed as a philosopher. There is no entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for example, for John Calvin. Nevertheless, I think he really does have a lot of important philosophical ideas, and in fact, a really major meta-philosophical idea, an idea about what kind of philosophy is compatible with the Christian faith. Now, what obscures this is that Calvin is notoriously hostile to philosophy. He disparages philosophy at every turn. And so it can be difficult to think of him as a philosopher when he clearly doesn't think much of philosophy. On the other hand, we think of Wittgenstein as a philosopher, and he doesn't think much of philosophy either. So I don't think that's disqualifying. I want to talk some about the core of Calvin's philosophical ideas, and then later we'll talk about his theological ideas and see how the two dovetail. Here is an example of his hostility to philosophy. He writes, "How lavishly in this respect have the whole body of philosophers betrayed their stupidity and want of sense! To say nothing of the others, whose absurdities are of still grosser description, how completely does Plato, the soberest and most religious of them all, lose himself in his round globe? What must be the case with the rest, when the leaders who ought to have set them an example commit such blunders and labor under such hallucinations?" Well, that isn't much of a recommendation of philosophy. In his commentary on 1 Corinthians, he gets even more hostile. Think about this. "For whatever knowledge and understanding a man has counts for nothing unless it rests upon true wisdom. And it's of no more value for grasping spiritual teaching than the eye of a blind man for distinguishing colors. Both of these must be carefully attended to, so that one, knowledge of all the sciences is so much smoke apart from the heavenly science of Christ, and two, that man with all his shrewdness is as stupid about understanding by himself the mysteries of God, as an ass is incapable of understanding musical harmony." So, in short, to teach secular philosophy is rather like relying on the eye of a blind person. It's a matter of, well, trying to teach a donkey music theory. He says it's hopeless. There's no way to do it. It is filled with stupidity, filled with ignorance, filled with hallucinations. It is something that we are simply incapable of doing. So the philosopher, to the extent that the philosophy is not founded on the Christian faith, he thinks, is wasting his time and wasting everybody else's time too. What he's trying to do cannot be done. Despite all of that, I think Calvin is a philosopher. And in fact, he has some interesting philosophical positions. I think he actually has two positions with respect to every philosophical question. And he thinks that Christian philosophers in general ought to. Now, that's a rather radical idea. A philosophy that takes one approach to almost any philosophical problem is bound to be making a mistake. The three basic questions of philosophy, as I see it, are first of all, what is there? The basic question of metaphysics. Secondly, how do we know? What can we know? Those are the basic questions of epistemology. And then finally, what should we do? The basic question of ethics. So what is there? How do we know? What should we do? Those are the basic philosophical questions. And most philosophers try to give an answer to them. Calvin says actually you need a pair of answers to each of them. Why? Because in his view, the fall of man was such a radical break from what is really our true inner nature that it forces you to rethink all of the fundamental questions. What is there? Well, there's the perspective one might take before the fall. There's the question of what we should think after the fall. The same with human knowledge. What are we by very nature capable of knowing? But then, after the fall, what can we know and how do we know it? And finally, what should we do? We could think of ethics in one way before the fall. We have to think of it in a radically different way after the fall. One way to look at it is this. The fall of man, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, was a radical break. It was something of not only an ethical catastrophe, but an epistemic catastrophe. It was something that fundamentally changed our capacities of knowledge. And so it constituted not merely a practical crisis and an ethical crisis, it was a question of an epistemological crisis. It devastated our ways of knowing. And so it forced us to change our entire attitude about the world, not only how to live in the world, but also how it's possible for us to know about the world and about God. And he thinks that our knowledge of God and our knowledge of ourselves are intimately connected. And so it turns out that that also radically affects our ability to understand ourselves. We could put it in these terms. Theologians occasionally talk about a Prelapsarian time or a Postlapsarian time. Lapse here referring to the fall. And so Prelapsarian is what was the case before the fall. Postlapsarian, what was the case after the fall. Calvin thinks we need two philosophies, two answers to every philosophical question. One a Prelapsarian answer, one a Postlapsarian answer. In effect, a Christian philosopher needs a Prelapsarian philosophy and a Postlapsarian philosophy to describe our situation now. Now here's the kind of thing I'm referring to. Calvin frequently has phrases somewhat like this: if Adam had stayed sinless, or if the depravity of man's mind did not lead it away from the right approach. It relates firstly to the condition in which we were originally created, and secondly to our condition immediately after Adam's fall. He sees the fall as corrupting us and degrading our faculties, badly injuring our ways of knowing and our ability to know anything. So he says we can't clearly and properly know God unless the knowledge of ourselves be added. This knowledge is twofold, relating first to the condition in which we were at first created, and secondly to our condition such as it began to be immediately after Adam's fall. For it would little avail us to know how we were created if we remained ignorant of the corruption and degradation of our nature in consequence of the fall. Our nature was corrupted, it was degraded as a result of the fall, and that has epistemological as well as ethical dimensions. We suffered tremendously. It is as if, to use Paul's phrase, we now see through a glass darkly, where we used to see much more closely at any rate to being face to face with God. This is something that he refers to frequently, the corruption and degradation of our nature, of our knowledge faculties, of our ethical capacities, of our basic understanding of the world, our ways of understanding the world. All of those have been corrupted, they've been degraded, and that has important implications for us. Now, I think it's important to recognize this is not just a beclouding, a marring, an obscuring, something like a fog that has been created between us and God, or us and reality. A lot of Eastern philosophers use that kind of metaphor, especially in the Buddhist tradition or the Neo-Confucian tradition. There is this thought of the soul becoming beclouded, and it needs to be wiped clean. That is not really the picture in Calvin. It's not that the mind is a mirror of nature, but the mirror gets cloudy after a while, it gets a film on it, and we have to clean it carefully. It's much more complicated than that, and much worse than that. The mirror itself has been broken. That's not to say it's useless. Something appears there. But it's not just a question of wiping it clean. It's a question of, well, having to get it replaced entirely. The mirror has been broken. And so there is something much more fundamental than a beclouding or an obscuring going on here. There is really a breaking, a corruption, a degradation. Our faculties have been badly harmed, not merely obscured. Here's how he puts it at one point in the Institutes. Soundness of mind and integrity of heart were at the same time withdrawn, and it is this which constitutes the corruption of natural gifts. For although there's still some residue of intelligence and judgment, as well as will, we cannot call a mind sound and entire, which is both weak and immersed in darkness. As to the will, its depravity is but too well known. Therefore, since reason, by which man discerns between good and evil, and by which he understands and judges, is a natural gift, it could not be entirely destroyed, but being partly weakened and partly corrupted, a shapeless ruin is all that remains. So the idea is this. We retained some aspects of our faculty. We retained, for example, a love of truth, but our ability to attain it is now limited. It's been severely impaired by the fact that our faculties are not just working in a fog, they have been broken. They are now degraded, corrupted. They are incapable of performing their proper function as they used to fulfill it. Well, this explains why philosophers, in Calvin's view, need two answers, a Prelapsarian answer and a Postlapsarian answer, to every philosophical question. The point is really very simple. A tremendous tragedy has befallen us. Our faculties have been degraded. And so we can think about what it was possible to know before the fall, and then what it's possible to know after the fall. How we would have gone about knowing before the fall, how we're forced to now go about knowing after the fall. And the same thing is true of the basic questions of ethics. What should we do? Well, there was one way we were capable of behaving before the fall. Now the best we can do is a rather second-rate version of that. We need a different way of approaching ethics after the fall, because it is no longer possible for us to abide by the principles that we could have abided by before the fall. Now, who do we blame for this? Can we blame God? Can we blame the serpent? Adam and Eve? No, it's really our own fault. We're to blame. We have damaged our own faculties. We've corrupted ourselves, degraded ourselves. We have sold ourselves into slavery. And so we are now in a position of being enslaved to sin and enslaved not only to the moral corruption that the fall entails, but to the epistemic corruption. And so we have put ourselves in this position. We have blinded ourselves, or at least made ourselves severely myopic. We have made it very difficult for us to have the kind of knowledge that we used to have, and so very difficult to live the kind of life we used to be capable of living.